Put your boots on the rock. Not the trail. The rock itself. Find a place where the path cuts through an exposed face of stone and press your hand flat against it. Feel how cold it is, how solid, how indifferent to the fact that you are standing there at all. You are somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains. Maybe Georgia, maybe Vermont, maybe one of the long green ridges in between. It does not matter exactly where. What matters is the rock under your hand. Ask yourself where it came from. Not in the way a hiker asks. In the way the question actually deserves to be asked. This rock is old in a way that the word old does not cover. The mountains you are standing in are among the most ancient on the surface of this planet. They were tall when there was nothing alive on land. They have been worn down by rain and wind for so long that what you are looking at now, these gentle rounded ridges, these soft green slopes, are the stumps of something that was once the height of the Himalayas. But here is the thing almost nobody tells you when they hand you a trail map and point you toward the nearest summit. These mountains did not begin as mountains. They began as ocean floor. The rock under your hand spent hundreds of millions of years at the bottom of a sea that no longer exists, a sea that was larger than the Atlantic Ocean is today, that had its own currents and its own depths and its own darkness, and that died completely, leaving nothing behind except the stone you are touching right now. That ocean had a name. Scientists call it Iapetus. And its story, how it was born, how it lived for 200 million years, how it died, and what its death built, is the story this documentary is going to tell. Because Iapetus is not a footnote. It is a preview. The Atlantic Ocean, sitting off the east coast of this country. The one on every map you have ever looked at. The one that feels as permanent as the sky. Is following the same path. It is older now than Iapetus was when Iapetus began to die. And the forces that ended Iapetus are already, slowly, quietly, beginning to reach for the Atlantic. Oceans are not permanent features of this planet. They are events. They have beginnings and middles and ends. They are born from wounds in continents. They grow across hundreds of millions of years. And they die when the Earth begins to take back what it made. This is the cycle. It has run before Iapetus. It will run after the Atlantic. It is running right now. In places you can see if you know where to look. And it started. Every single time. Not with water. It started with a crack. Go to East Africa, not to the savannas or the forests, not to the places that appear in wildlife documentaries. Go to the part of East Africa that runs in a long diagonal line from Mozambique in the south up through Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, all the way to the Afar Triangle, where the land drops so low it sits below sea level in places, where the ground is black and cracked, and the heat rises off the rocks in visible waves and almost nothing grows. This place is called the East African Rift Valley, and it is one of the strangest places on the surface of the earth. Not because of what it looks like, but because of what it is doing. It is tearing apart. Right now, as you read this, as you breathe, as the world goes about its ordinary business, the continent of Africa is splitting. The eastern portion, sometimes called the Somali Plate, is pulling away from the rest of Africa at a rate of roughly ½ an inch per year. The ground between them is sinking. The crust is thinning. Volcanoes have appeared along the edges of the rift, leaking magma up through the cracks that the separation is creating. ½ an inch per year sounds like nothing, and in any human lifetime, it is nothing. But the Earth does not work in human lifetimes. ½ an inch per year. sustained across 10 million years, is a distance you could drive across in a few hours. Sustained across 100 million years. It is a distance you would need days to cross. Sustained across 200 million years. It begins to look like the width of an ocean. That is the pace of a continent deciding to become two continents. Invisible in any single life. Unstoppable across geological time. The East African Rift Valley is not a geological curiosity. It is the first sentence of a story about an ocean being born. Whether that story gets to its second sentence, whether the rift continues long enough and deep enough to eventually fill with seawater, is something that will not be resolved in any time frame a human civilization can track. But the first sentence is already being written. You can go there and stand in it. This is how every ocean on this planet began. A continent, for reasons that are still not entirely simple, starts to pull apart. The crust above the separation point begins to thin. The rock below it, which is hot and partially molten under the enormous pressure of everything above it, begins to rise toward the surface. As that pressure releases, the ground drops. The edges of the rift rise slightly, forming long parallel ridges on either side of a widening valley. The whole system produces heat, volcanic activity, earthquakes. It is violent in slow motion. In the very early stages, the rift is just a valley. A long, narrow, sunken valley with steep walls and a floor that sits lower than the surrounding land. The Rift Valley in East Africa looks like this today. So does the Basin and Range province of the American Southwest. Though that system is older and has been running longer, so did the area that would eventually become the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 200 million years ago, when the supercontinent Pangaea first began to come apart at the seams. The valley fills with freshwater lakes at first. The topography traps rainfall and runoff. The lakes can be enormous, hundreds of miles long and extraordinarily deep, fed by rivers draining down the rift walls. Lake Tanganyika in East Africa, one of the deepest lakes on the planet, sits in exactly this kind of structure. It is nearly 1,000 miles long and drops to almost 1.5 miles in depth. It has been filling the African rift for millions of years. And if the rift continues to widen, Lake Tanganyika will eventually become a seaway. Eventually is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The transition from freshwater lake to actual sea requires something that the rift cannot provide for itself. It requires connection to an ocean that already exists. The rift has to widen and deepen enough that the sea level of a neighboring ocean can breach the barrier between them, pouring salt water into the basin for the first time. When that happens, everything changes. The water becomes salty. The chemistry of the basin shifts. Marine organisms move in. The character of what is being deposited on the floor of the basin changes from the sediments of a freshwater lake to the sediments of a shallow sea. And the rift, which was a wound in a continent, begins to become something else. It begins to become a coastline. Two coastlines. Actually, one on either side of the widening gap. The continent that was one thing is now two things. And between them, where there was once rock, there is now water. The Red Sea is the best example of this transition currently visible on the surface of the Earth. Roughly 30 million years ago, Arabia began to separate from Africa. The rift between them filled with seawater from the Indian Ocean. What exists today is a narrow, elongated body of water, roughly 1,200 miles long and less than 200 miles wide at its widest point, with one of the saltiest and warmest surface waters of any ocean body on the planet. The Red Sea looks like an ocean that someone started and did not finish. And that is almost exactly what it is. At its center, running along its length like a spine, there is a feature that changes how you understand what this body of water actually is. A mid-ocean ridge, a place where the seafloor is being actively created, where molten rock is rising from below and solidifying and pushing the two sides of the Red Sea apart, millimeter by millimeter, year by year. The Red Sea is an ocean in its infancy. If Arabia and Africa continue to separate, the Red Sea will widen. In 10 million years, it might look something like the modern Mediterranean. In 50 million years, it might look like a narrow Atlantic. In 100 million years, if the spreading continues, the civilization that might exist on its shores, if any civilization exists at all by then, will look out over a body of water as wide as any ocean on the current map, and not have any way of knowing that it was once a crack in a continent. That is the arc. That is the first act of the story. But the story of how an ocean begins is actually two stories running at the same time. And the second one is less visible than the first. While the surface of the rift is filling with water and coastlines are forming and life is colonizing the new shallows, something is happening at the bottom of the new sea that will determine everything about its future. The floor is being made. And the floor, it turns out, is the most important part of the whole story. Because the floor is not permanent. The floor is a conveyor belt. And what that conveyor belt does, over hundreds of millions of years, is the engine that drives the entire cycle from birth to death and back again. That engine deserves its own chapter. For now, stand back in the East African Rift and look at those long, straight valleys, those parallel ridges, that lake that might one day be a sea. This is what the beginning looks like. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a continent, very slowly, deciding to become two continents, and in the space between them, something enormous is being prepared. Stand on the shore of the Red Sea at night. The water in front of you is warm, not comfortable bath warm, warm in a way that feels slightly wrong, like the ocean is running a low fever. The salt content here is higher than almost any other body of water on the planet. The air is heavy. The stars above the Sinai Peninsula are extraordinary, unpolluted by anything except the heat rising off the desert behind you. You are standing on one of the youngest coastlines on Earth. The rock under your feet was part of the African continent 30 million years ago. The basin in front of you did not exist 30 million years ago. What existed instead was more land, more desert, more of the same ancient African crust stretching east to where Arabia now sits. And then the ground began to pull apart, and the sea came in, and the coastline you are standing on was born. 30 million years is not very long. The dinosaurs had already been gone for 30 million years before this coastline existed. The Himalayas were already rising. Early horses were already running across North American grasslands. The Earth was, by any reasonable measure, already very close to the world we know. And yet, this coast, this water, this sea did not exist yet. That is how young the Red Sea is. And youth, in an ocean, is written into everything. The water is warm because the crust beneath it is thin and hot, still close to the mantle below, still radiating the heat of its own creation. The salt content is high because the basin is narrow enough and the climate dry enough that evaporation outpaces the input of fresh water, concentrating the minerals in the water that remains. The seafloor, at the center of the Red Sea, is almost unnervingly flat and fresh, covered in basalt that erupted from below within the last few million years. Some of it within the last few thousand. This is new rock, planetary newborn rock. Rock that has never been anywhere except the mantle and, now, the floor of this young sea. Here is what that means, and why it matters for everything that comes after. When the Red Sea began to open, the crust that forms its floor did not exist. There was no sea floor waiting to be uncovered by the spreading continents. The sea floor was made as the sea opened, created at the central ridge where the two sides of the basin pull apart, extruded from below as liquid rock and solidified into the flat, dark basalt that covers the deep ocean floor everywhere on this planet. The ocean floor is not ancient. The ocean floor is continuously manufactured. This sounds like a minor technical detail. It is one of the most consequential facts about how this planet works. Because if the floor is being continuously made at the center, something has to happen at the edges. Matter does not simply accumulate forever. The Earth is not expanding. Something has to give. And what gives? Eventually, in every ocean that lives long enough, is the edge of the ocean floor itself, which begins to sink back into the mantle from which it came. But in a young sea, that day is far away. The Red Sea has not yet reached the stage where its edges are old enough and heavy enough to begin that sinking. It is still in the first flush of creation, still widening, still making new floor faster than any part of it is old enough to become a problem. This is what Iapetus looked like 600 million years ago, when it was new. We cannot go to Iapetus. It is gone, not dormant, not transformed, not renamed. Gone in the most complete sense that a thing can be gone, which is that every drop of water it contained, every square mile of seafloor it built, every coastal shelf where ancient life once lived, has been consumed by the earth itself and remade into something else entirely. What we have instead are the rocks it left behind, not the ocean rocks. Those are gone, recycled back into the mantle long ago. What remain are the rocks from the edges, the continental margins where Iapetus met the land on either side of it, compressed and folded and pushed upward when the ocean finally closed. Those rocks are in the Appalachians. They are in Scotland and Scandinavia and the Canadian Maritimes. Geologists have spent over a century piecing Iapetus back together from these remnants, matching rock types across the Atlantic, tracing fault lines that run from one continent to another, reading in the mineral chemistry of ancient stones, the signature of an ocean that has not existed for 300 million years. And what they have assembled from all of this detective work is a portrait of an ocean that was, at its peak, extraordinary. Iapetus opened roughly 600 million years ago, in the aftermath of the breakup of a supercontinent called Rodinia. Think of Rodinia the way you might think of Pangaea, which is more familiar. All the continents gathered into one. Then the interior begins to heat up, the crust thins, rifts open, and the whole structure begins to come apart. When Rodinia came apart, the rift that formed between the pieces that would eventually become North America and the pieces that would eventually become Europe and Africa became the birthplace of Iapetus. For the first tens of millions of years, Iapetus was a young sea like the Red Sea, narrow, hot-floored, salty, full of new basalt at its center and shallow coastal waters along its margins. The world around it looked nothing like anything alive today would recognize. The continents were bare rock. There were no plants on land, no animals on land. Life existed, but it existed entirely in the sea. And the sea life of 600 million years ago was nothing like what swims in any ocean today. Iapetus did not know any of this. Of course, an ocean does not know anything. But if you could somehow stand on its young shore, the shore of a sea that was just beginning its 200 million year life, you would smell salt and volcanic sulfur and the particular blank mineral smell of rock that has never had anything organic happen to it. The water in front of you would be clear in a way that modern ocean water is not, because the kind of life that clouds ocean water with its presence had not yet fully developed. The sky would be a color that human eyes have never seen, because the atmosphere itself was different. And below you, in that clear, warm water, the ocean floor would be spreading apart at roughly the same rate. Your fingernails are growing right now. That is the pace of an ocean being born. The pace of fingernails growing over 50 million years. That pace moves the edges of a young sea hundreds of miles apart. Over 100 million years. 1,000 miles. Over 200 million years. Which is roughly how long Iapetus lived at its widest. The two shorelines that began as the edges of a single rift are separated by a distance greater than the modern Atlantic. Think about what that means in practical terms. The coastline that is now the eastern edge of North America and the coastline that is now Western Europe and Northwest Africa were once the same shoreline. They were the edges of the same rift, the same wound in the same continent. When Iapetus opened between them, they began the longest separation in the history of the rocks we can read. They moved apart for 200 million years. Then they came back together. And everything that existed between them, all that water, all that sea floor, all those hundreds of millions of years of ocean, disappeared. How that happened, and what it looked like when it did, requires understanding something about the floor of a mature ocean that is impossible to see in a young sea like the Red Sea, because the Red Sea is too new for it to have happened yet. It requires understanding what happens when the ocean floor gets old. And what happens when the ocean floor gets old is the most important thing about this entire story, because it is the thing that makes an ocean mortal. Find a map of the ocean floor, not a map of the continents with blue painted between them. An actual seafloor map, the kind that shows what is down there beneath all that water. The kind that took decades of sonar surveys and satellite measurements to produce, and that most people have never looked at, because it does not appear in any school textbook they were ever handed. What those maps show is not what most people expect. The seafloor is not flat. It is not a featureless plain of mud stretching from one continent to another like the bottom of a very large bathtub. It is one of the most dramatic landscapes on this planet, full of mountain ranges taller than the Rockies, trenches deeper than Everest is tall, vast plains of ancient basalt that stretch for thousands of miles in every direction, underwater plateaus the size of continents, and running through all of it, connecting every ocean basin to every other ocean basin, like the seam of a baseball stitched across the entire globe. The longest continuous mountain range on Earth. Most people have never heard of it. It is called the Mid-Ocean Ridge System. It runs 65,000 miles in total length, winding through every ocean basin on the planet, always staying roughly equidistant from the continents on either side of it, always following the center of the spreading zone that created the ocean around it. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge runs straight down the center of the Atlantic, roughly equidistant from North America on one side and Europe and Africa on the other. The East Pacific Rise does the same thing in the Pacific. The Southwest Indian Ridge does it in the Indian Ocean. This mountain range surfaces above the water in a handful of places. The most famous is Iceland, a volcanic island sitting directly on top of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, split straight down its middle by the boundary between the North American Plate and the Eurasian Plate. You can walk to a place in Iceland and put one hand on rock that belongs to North America and one hand on rock that belongs to Europe. The gap between your hands is widening right now. Slowly, the way everything in this story widens. From above, on a seafloor map, the mid-ocean ridge system looks like the exposed skeleton of the planet, which is almost exactly what it is. This is where the ocean floor is born. At the center of the ridge, in a zone that runs along its length called the Rift Valley, something is happening that has no real equivalent at the surface of the Earth. The two sides of the ocean are pulling apart. The gap between them is filled continuously by magma rising from the mantle below, which pushes up through the crust, encounters the near-freezing seawater above it, and solidifies almost instantly into new basalt. This new basalt becomes new seafloor. The next pulse of magma pushes it aside and becomes more new seafloor. The pulse after that pushes both of them aside and becomes still more new seafloor. The ocean floor is a conveyor belt running away from the ridge in both directions, being manufactured at the center and pushed outward toward the edges at a rate that varies from ocean to ocean, but never stops entirely. This process is called seafloor spreading, and the speed at which it runs is measured in the same units as the speed at which your fingernails grow, because the numbers are roughly the same. Less than an inch per year in slow-spreading systems like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, several inches per year in fast-spreading systems like the East Pacific Rise. The Atlantic grows more slowly than the Pacific, but both of them grow. And here is the consequence of that growth that changes everything else in this story. As the seafloor moves away from the ridge, it ages. It also cools, because it is moving steadily away from the heat source that created it. The fresh basalt that erupted at the ridge was hot enough to glow. By the time it has traveled a few hundred miles from the ridge, it has cooled to ambient ocean temperature. By the time it has traveled 1,000 miles, it has been cooling for tens of millions of years. And as it cools, it does something that seems simple, but carries enormous consequences. It gets denser. Cold rock is denser than hot rock. As oceanic crust ages on its long journey away from the ridge, it becomes, very gradually, heavier than the rock it rides on. The difference is not dramatic in any given million years, but over tens of millions of years, the cumulative cooling and densification of the oceanic crust produces a slab of rock that is meaningfully, measurably heavier than the rock immediately adjacent to it. When that slab reaches the far edge of the ocean basin and encounters the lighter rock of a continent waiting on the other side, it can no longer hold its position at the surface. It has become too heavy to float. It sinks. Not quickly, not with any drama that could be perceived in a human lifetime. The way everything in this story moves, which is so slowly that the entire run of human civilization, from the first cities to the present day, would barely register as a pause in the process. But the oceanic crust, old and cold and dense, begins to bend downward at the edge of the basin, curving under the continental crust above it and descending into the mantle below. This process is called subduction, and subduction is how an ocean dies. The descending slab creates a trench at the point where it begins its downward bend, a long, narrow, extraordinarily deep valley in the seafloor that marks the line where the oceanic plate is diving beneath the continent, the Mariana Trench in the Western Pacific. the deepest place on Earth, reaches nearly 7 miles below the ocean surface. It sits above a subduction zone where the Pacific Plate is descending beneath the Mariana Plate. The trench is not a random geographic feature. It is the physical mark left by a plate bending downward. The crease in the ocean floor where the crust begins its one-way journey into the mantle. As the descending slab goes deeper, the heat and pressure around it cause it to release water and other volatile compounds that were locked into its minerals during its time on the ocean floor. Those released fluids rise into the rock above the descending slab. They lower the melting point of that rock. The rock begins to melt. The melt rises toward the surface. It erupts. This is why the Pacific Rim is called the Ring of Fire. Every major volcanic arc along the Pacific margin, the Cascades in the Pacific Northwest, the volcanoes of Japan and the Philippines and Indonesia, the Andes in South America, exists because an oceanic plate is descending beneath a continental plate somewhere offshore, releasing fluids that trigger melting in the rock above. The volcanoes are the exhaust of subduction. They are the visible evidence, at the surface, of an ocean floor being consumed far below. Now here is the fact that makes this concrete in a way that no description of deep ocean processes fully can. Almost all oceanic crust on Earth is younger than roughly 200 million years, with only rare fragments older than that preserved in unusual geological settings on land. That number is not a coincidence. It is not a sampling bias, an artifact of which parts of the ocean floor have been studied versus which have not. It is the fundamental operating constraint of the system. Oceanic crust, older than roughly 200 million years, in almost every case, been consumed by subduction. It became dense enough, through cooling, to sink. It descended into the mantle. It was melted, assimilated, recycled. Its minerals are now part of the mantle it returned to, indistinguishable from the rock that was never ocean floor at all. Continental crust, by contrast, is ancient, the stable cores of the continents. The regions geologists call cratons contain rocks that are 3 and 4 billion years old. Some of them are older. Continental crust is lighter than oceanic crust and cannot be subducted in the same way. When continental crust reaches a subduction zone, it resists descent. It crumples. It thickens. It builds mountains. But it does not disappear into the mantle. It accumulates. It persists. It carries the memory of the planet's surface history in its rocks across timescales that oceanic crust simply cannot survive. The ocean floor has no long memory. The continents remember everything. This is the fundamental asymmetry that drives the entire Wilson cycle. And it is the reason that the mountains you are standing on in the Appalachians are readable records of a vanished ocean, while the ocean floor of Iapetus itself is completely gone. And now, before moving to what this means for a specific ocean and a specific cycle, there is a detail from the other side of the planet that makes all of this more concrete than any diagram ever could. Near the summit of Mount Everest, in the rock, at the highest point on the surface of this planet, there are fossils, marine fossils, the shells of sea creatures, limestone formed from the compressed remains of organisms that lived in shallow tropical ocean water, sitting at 29,000 feet above sea level, higher than any commercial aircraft cruises, higher than any weather system can sustain precipitation, higher than almost anything except the sky above it. That rock was not always there. It was on the floor of an ocean called Tethys, an ocean that stretched from what is now Spain eastward all the way to Southeast Asia. that hosted 200 million years of extraordinary marine life, that died when the subcontinent of India moved northward into Asia and the oceanic floor between them was consumed by subduction. The collision that followed closed Tethys completely. Everything that had been sitting on the floor of Tethys, every layer of sediment, every compressed shell, every accumulated remnant of the organisms that had lived in that ocean across its entire 200 million year lifespan, was caught between the two approaching continents and had nowhere to go except up. The compressed shells of Tethys's creatures went up with the mountains. They are still going up. The Himalayas are still rising. India has not stopped moving. The collision that killed Tethys is still ongoing, still adding altitude to the highest mountains on the planet, still pushing the former ocean floor of a vanished tropical sea higher into the sky with every passing million years. The highest point on Earth is made of ocean floor. Sit with that for a moment, because it is not a metaphor. It is not a poetic approximation of something that is only loosely true. The rock at the summit of Everest was hundreds of millions of years ago, sitting at the bottom of a warm, shallow sea. The organisms whose compressed remains form the limestone in that rock were alive in that sea, feeding and reproducing and dying in warm water, with nothing above them except the ocean surface and the sky beyond it. They are now at the top of the world. That is what the conveyor belt does. At the end of the line, it does not simply erase the ocean and leave nothing behind. It compresses and folds and pushes upward everything that was sitting on the ocean floor when the closing began. It turns ocean into mountain. It takes the memory of a sea and writes it in stone at an altitude where the air is too thin to breathe and the temperature drops low enough to kill an unprotected person in minutes. This is what happened to Iapetus. This is what the Appalachians are. The rock under your hand on any trail in the eastern United States is not simply old rock. It is the compressed and uplifted remnant of a seafloor, pushed skyward by a collision that happened when land life on this planet was just beginning to figure out how legs worked. The gentleness of the Appalachians now, their rounded profiles and forested slopes and comfortable hiking trails, is the result of 300 million years of patient erosion working on what was once a Himalayan skyline. The ocean built those mountains when it died, and the ocean that built them, the ocean that lived for 200 million years and died so completely that not a molecule of its water survives, was following a process that is still running today, the same process that is running under the Red Sea right now, in its youth, the same process that will eventually run under the Atlantic, in its old age. The conveyor belt does not have an off switch. It just keeps running. Open Google Maps. Zoom out until you can see the whole Atlantic, the eastern seaboard of the United States on the left side of the screen, the coastlines of Europe and Africa on the right. Between them, that enormous blue expanse, nearly 5,000 miles across at its widest point, deep enough in the middle to swallow the tallest buildings ever constructed by human hands, with miles of cold, dark water still above them. Look at it for a moment. Your brain, without being asked, registers this as a fixed fact of geography, the same way it registers the existence of the sun or the direction of north. The Atlantic is there. It has always been there. It will always be there. Every map you have ever seen puts it in the same place, between the same continents, at roughly the same size. Every political and cultural institution of the modern Western world has been organized around it as a permanent feature of the physical landscape. Your brain is doing what human brains do. which is to take the world as it currently appears and assume that is how the world has always been and will always be. And in this particular case, your brain is wrong. The Atlantic Ocean is moving right now. Its floor is spreading apart at the mid-Atlantic ridge, adding roughly 2.5 centimeters of new width every year. 2.5 centimeters is about the width of your index finger. The ocean is getting 1 index finger wider every single year. It has been doing this for roughly 180 million years, which is why it is now nearly 5,000 miles across, and it shows no sign of stopping anytime soon. You cannot feel this. No instrument available to ordinary experience can detect it, but it is happening with the same certainty and the same indifference to human observation as the rotation of the Earth and the orbit of the Moon. The Atlantic is growing. It is growing right now, today, at this moment, as the world goes about all of its ordinary business on its shores. The Atlantic is one of the younger major oceans on this planet. 180 million years sounds old by any standard a human lifetime can apply. But in ocean terms, in the terms of the cycle that this story is about, 180 million years is solidly middle-aged at most. The Pacific is significantly older in parts, with some portions of its floor dating back well over 100 million years. Though much of its oldest floor has already been consumed by the subduction zones that ring it, the Atlantic has not yet reached the stage where subduction is consuming its edges in any significant way. Its passive margins, the coastlines of North America and Europe and Africa, are geologically quiet. No major trenches, no ring of fire, no volcanic arcs above active subduction zones. The Atlantic, right now, is in the longest and most deceptive phase of an ocean's life. The phase that looks, from the outside, indistinguishable from permanence. When an ocean is young, its youth is obvious. The Red Sea announces itself as a work in progress through its narrowness, its heat, its extraordinary salinity, the volcanic activity running down its spine. Nobody stands on the shore of the Red Sea and thinks this has been here forever. When an ocean is in decline, its decline announces itself through violence. Subduction zones produce trenches and island arcs and volcanoes and earthquakes. The margins of a dying ocean are geologically loud. They are the noisiest places on the surface of the planet. But a mature ocean, an ocean in the long, stable middle of its existence, makes no such announcements. The spreading at the ridge is too slow to feel. The margins are quiet. The coastlines are stable enough that entire civilizations have grown up on them across thousands of years without any geological disruption worth recording in human history. Everything about a mature ocean communicates permanence, because everything that is happening to it is happening at a pace so far below the threshold of human perception that it might as well not be happening at all. This is the most deceptive phase. Not because anything dangerous is being concealed, but because the very stability of the system makes it almost impossible for anything living on its shores to understand that the system is not actually stable. It is just stable on a timescale that dwarfs everything a biological creature can perceive. Think about what the Atlantic has meant to the history of this country and this civilization. Every European voyage to the Americas crossed it. Every enslaved African brought to the New World crossed it. Every soldier shipped overseas to fight in the First and Second World Wars crossed it. Every diplomatic cable, every transatlantic phone call, every fiber optic internet connection carrying the data of the modern digital world runs across its floor or through its waters. The entire political and cultural architecture of what we call the Western world, the relationships between nations, the patterns of trade, The distribution of languages and religions and legal systems across the globe has been shaped by the existence of this ocean, in this location, at this size. None of the people who built any of that had any way of knowing they were building on something temporary. They were not wrong to build. The Atlantic will remain navigable and roughly the size it currently is for longer than any human institution is likely to last. Longer than the English language is likely to survive in recognizable form. Longer than the nations currently bordering it are likely to exist as coherent political entities. The timescales on which the Atlantic will change beyond recognition are so vast that no civilization currently alive needs to account for them in any practical plan. But the permanence those civilizations assumed was not geological permanence. It was human permanence, the kind that holds across lifetimes and generations and centuries, the kind that feels from the inside of a human life. Like the only kind that matters, there is another kind. The Atlantic is 2.5 centimeters wider right now than it was at this time last year. It was 2.5 centimeters wider last year than the year before. Every year. Without announcement. Without any event that any instrument on the shore can detect. The ocean that the modern world was built around adds one more finger width to its span. And somewhere in its future, at a distance that makes the entire history of human civilization look like a rounding error, the spreading will slow. The balance between creation at the ridge and consumption at the margins will tip. The passive margins that are quiet right now will begin to show signs of activity. Subduction will begin to consume the Atlantic floor at its edges. The ocean that has been growing for 180 million years will begin, almost imperceptibly, to shrink. When exactly that will happen is a question scientists are actively working on. Some models suggest that very early signs of Atlantic closure may already be visible in the geology of the Caribbean, where subduction is occurring at the margins of the small plates caught between North and South America, and near Gibraltar, where the African and Eurasian plates are pressing together and squeezing what remains of the old Tethys Seaway into the remnant we call the Mediterranean. Whether those zones represent the early stages of a broader Atlantic closure system, or are simply local phenomena, unconnected to the Atlantic's long-term fate, is genuinely debated among geologists who work on these questions. What is not debated is the arc. Every ocean that has ever existed on this planet has followed the same arc, born from a rift in a continent, grown through seafloor spreading, reached a long, stable middle age that looked, from the outside, like permanence, then tipped into decline as subduction began consuming the floor faster than the ridge could replace it, then closed as the continents on either side moved toward each other across a shrinking sea, then died, leaving behind a mountain range and a suture zone and a story written in rock for anyone who knows how to read it. The Atlantic is on this arc. It is somewhere in the middle of it. The exact position difficult to determine from inside the system. The same way it is difficult to determine the midpoint of a human life while you are living it. But here is what makes the Atlantic different from every ocean discussed so far in this story. And the thing that makes this chapter different from the ones that preceded it. We are living on its shores. The people who lived on the shores of Iapetus did not exist. There were no people, no complex land animals, no forests, nothing that would recognize itself in any description a modern mind could construct. The shores of Iapetus were bare rock and shallow water and the slow crawl of marine life that had not yet learned how to leave the sea. The shores of the Atlantic are covered in cities, in highways and airports and container ports and nuclear power plants. In 500 years of recorded colonial history and several thousand years of human settlement stretching back to the first peoples who walked to the coast and looked out at the water and built their lives around what they found there. The Atlantic is not just an ocean in the middle of its life cycle. It is the ocean that the modern world assembled itself around. And it is, by every measure that geology can apply, a temporary feature of a planet that has been making and destroying oceans for billions of years. That is not a cause for alarm. The timescales involved make alarm an absurd response. It is not even really a cause for philosophical discomfort, once you sit with it long enough. What it is a cause for a particular kind of perspective shift. The kind that happens when you suddenly understand that the stage on which all of human history has been performed is not the permanent backdrop it appeared to be. That the ocean, which has defined the geography and the geopolitics and the cultural imagination of Western civilization for half a millennium, is a feature of a particular moment in the 4.5 billion year history of this planet. And that this moment, like every other moment in that history, is already in the process of becoming something else. Look at the Atlantic one more time, not as a body of water between two sets of continents, as an event, as a process that began 180 million years ago and will end at some point in a future too distant to meaningfully imagine, when the forces that opened it have run their course and the forces that will close it have finished their work. When you look at it that way, something changes. The ocean does not get smaller. It gets more interesting. It becomes something more than geography. It becomes a clock, a record, a chapter in a story that began long before it existed and will continue long after it is gone. And the question it raises, the question that the next chapter is going to answer in full, is what that story looks like when the clock runs all the way down. We know what it looks like. It looks like the Appalachians. "600 million years ago, a continent began to break apart. The continent is called Rodinia. You will not find it on any map because it has not existed for more than 500 million years. But it was real, and it was enormous. And when it came apart, the pieces that split away from each other became the raw material of the world we live in now. The crack that opened in Rodinia was not dramatic. It never is. A rift valley. The same process happening in East Africa today. The ground sinking along a line hundreds of miles long. Volcanoes appearing along the edges. Heat rising from below. Then water, working its way in from whatever ocean existed at the margins of the old supercontinent, trickling through the lowest points of the new rift, beginning the slow, patient work of filling what the splitting continent had opened. And then, slowly, over millions of years, the sea, this is Iapetus being born. The name comes from Greek mythology. Iapetus was a titan, one of the original gods who preceded the Olympians, the father of Atlas, who held up the sky, and Prometheus, who stole fire for humanity. Geologists gave this ancient ocean the name because it was, in a meaningful sense, the parent of the Atlantic. It occupied roughly the same geographic space between the pieces of continent that would eventually become North America on one side and Europe and Africa on the other. The Atlantic is the younger ocean. Iapetus came first, occupied the same territory, and died before the Atlantic was born. The mythological parentage is appropriate. For the first 100 million years of its life, Iapetus did what every young ocean does. Its floor was made at the central ridge. Its shores moved steadily apart. The continents on either side of it drifted away from each other across an arrangement of land and sea that would be completely unrecognizable on any map a modern person has ever seen. The world that Iapetus opened into was a different planet in almost every way that matters. The continents were positioned differently, gathered into configurations that left the geography of the modern world entirely unrecognizable. The atmosphere carried far less oxygen than the air you are breathing right now. Though, by 600 million years ago, the great oxygenation events of the earlier Earth had already produced enough free oxygen to support the beginnings of complex animal life in the sea. The land was completely bare, not bare in the way that a desert is bare. With its wind-sculpted rocks and its drought-adapted organisms and its occasional scrub, bare in a way that has not existed on the surface of this planet for hundreds of millions of years. Every rock on every continent was exposed directly to wind and rain and ultraviolet radiation from a sun that had no ozone layer to filter it, unprotected by any layer of soil, by any root system, by any biological crust of bacteria or lichen. The continents were stone, just stone, all the way to the horizon in every direction. But in the sea, something was happening that had never happened before in the history of life on this planet. The period that Iapetus opened into, running from roughly 600 million to 500 million years ago, includes one of the most consequential biological events in the entire history of life on Earth: the Cambrian explosion, the sudden appearance, in the fossil record of the world's ancient rocks, of almost every major body plan that animal life has ever used. Before this period, the fossil record shows a world of microbial mats and soft-bodied organisms. Life that was real and that had been running the chemistry of the planet for billions of years. But life that left almost nothing in the way of hard structures that rock could preserve across geological time. After the Cambrian explosion, the ocean was full of creatures with eyes, with legs, with shells and claws and segmented bodies and jaws and every other basic architectural feature that animals have been building themselves out of ever since. The diversity of body plans that appeared in this relatively short window of geological time is so extraordinary that paleontologists spent decades arguing about whether the fossil record was showing them something real or showing them an artifact of preservation and sampling. It was showing them something real. Iapetus was one of the ocean worlds in which this transformation unfolded. Its waters, its chemistry, its patterns of circulation and upwelling, its shallow coastal shelves where sunlight could reach the bottom and life could build complex communities. All of these were part of the environment in which animal life first became something that a modern eye would recognize as genuinely diverse and genuinely complex. Creatures like those preserved in the Buries Shale, that extraordinary fossil bed in the Canadian Rockies that captures a snapshot of Cambrian marine life in extraordinary detail, lived along the continental margins of this changing world. In the shallow, warm waters where the ancient continents that bordered Iapetus met the open sea, trilobites crawled across the floors of these ancient oceans in numbers and varieties that are almost impossible to appreciate from the fossil record alone. Some of the earliest creatures that could reasonably be called vertebrates, animals with a notochord and a distinct head, and the very beginnings of the body plan that eventually produced fish and amphibians and reptiles and mammals, and you swam through the water column of these ancient seas. The ocean was alive, in the full complex sense that the word alive can carry, for the first time in its existence. And then, somewhere around 480 million years ago, something changed at the edges of Iapetus. It did not change with any signal that the organisms living in the ocean could detect. No shift in water temperature that a trilobite could perceive as different from ordinary seasonal variation. No change in current patterns that anything alive could recognize as the beginning of something irreversible. No announcement of any kind. what changed was happening far below, in the cold and the dark, at the deepest margins of the ocean basin, where the oldest portions of the Iapetus seafloor had been traveling away from the central ridge for so long that the physics of cooling rock had finally done what cooling rock always does. The oldest floor had become dense enough to sink. The first subduction zone formed at the margins of Iapetus. Picture what this looks like in the physical reality of the ocean. The seafloor, which has been spreading steadily outward from the central ridge for over 100 million years, reaches the far edge of the basin. In every earlier moment of the ocean's history, that edge was a passive margin, a place where the oceanic crust simply transitioned to continental crust, a quiet boundary. Now, for the first time, the oceanic crust, arriving at the margin, is old enough and cold enough and dense enough that it cannot maintain its position at the surface. It begins to bend downward. The front edge of the oceanic plate tilts toward the mantle. The slab begins its descent. Above the sinking slab, the familiar consequences begin to unfold. The descending rock releases its trapped water and volatiles under heat and pressure. Those fluids rise into the overlying rock and trigger melting. Volcanoes appear above the subduction zone, erupting through the seafloor to build chains of islands along the margin of the ocean. The same process that today builds the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, the volcanic arcs of Japan and the Philippines, the island chains of the Caribbean, was building similar structures along the margins of Iapetus 480 million years ago. And the ocean, which had been growing continuously for over 100 million years, quietly, without any observable event, began to shrink. The next chapter of Iapetus's life lasted roughly 60 million years. The ocean contracted. The continents on either side of it, which had been moving apart since the rift first opened in Rodinia, gradually reversed their apparent motion relative to each other. They were still being moved by the same forces that had always moved them, but now the floor between them was being consumed faster than the ridge was producing it. And so the net effect was that the two sides of the ocean were getting closer together every million years, even as the ridge continued to manufacture new floor at the center. The island arcs above the subduction zones grew larger. Fragments of continental material that had been riding on the oceanic plates, approaching the subduction zones, were scraped off and plastered against the continental margins, adding new terrains of exotic rock to the edges of the approaching continents. The shallow seas between the island arcs and the continents they were approaching became complicated. Tangled environments full of volcanic ash and the compressed sediments of an ocean floor being slowly squeezed out of existence. The ocean got narrower every million years. And then, somewhere around 420 million years ago, in a series of events that geologists have given the names Taconic, Caledonian, Acadian, and Alleghanian, the ocean ran out of floor. The continents hit each other. There is no precise moment that captures this. Continental collisions are not events in the way that earthquakes or volcanic eruptions are events. They are conditions. Sustained conditions of enormous pressure that build incrementally across tens of millions of years and release themselves not in any single dramatic moment, but in the slow, patient, inexorable upward compression of everything caught between two converging walls of continental rock. What was caught between the converging continents of Proto-North America and Proto-Europe and Proto-Africa was the last of everything Iapetus had built. The sediments that had accumulated on its floor across hundreds of millions of years of biological productivity, layer upon layer of compressed organic material and mineral deposits, and the remains of every organism that had lived and died in its waters. The rocks of its margins, already deformed by the earlier stages of the collision. The remnants of the island arcs that had formed above the subduction zones and been pushed ahead of the advancing continental fronts. All of it was caught in the closing vice. All of it was pushed upward. The mountains that rose from the death of Iapetus were not the modest, rounded, forested ridges that you walk through today on any trail in the eastern United States. The geological models, built from the evidence available to modern science, suggest that, at their peak, the mountains produced by the closing of Iapetus stood as tall as the modern Himalayas, peaks reaching 6 or 7 miles above sea level, a skyline that, if any eye capable of appreciating it had existed to look at it, would have been as imposing and as dramatic as anything on the surface of the earth today. There was no such eye. The organisms alive, when those mountains reached their greatest height, were early amphibians, experimenting with life on land and the first primitive reptiles. None of them were looking at mountain ranges and thinking about what they meant. But the mountains were there, and they were enormous. And then they began the long, slow process of becoming what they are today. 300 million years of rain is a very long time. Rain falls on rock and dissolves it slightly with every drop. Water finds cracks and freezes in them and expands and splits the rock a little further with every winter. Rivers carry fragments of mountain down to the sea and deposit them on continental shelves and in ocean basins. Glaciers grind peaks into rounded shapes over millions of years of advance and retreat. The whole enormous mass of mountain that the death of Iapetus produced was subjected to this patient, relentless, entirely indifferent process of erosion for 300 million years. What remains is the Appalachians. They run from Alabama to Newfoundland, nearly 2,000 miles of continuous ridge and valley terrain. One of the longest mountain chains in the world. In the southern Appalachians, in the Blue Ridge and the Great Smoky Mountains, the rocks include some of the oldest exposed stone in eastern North America, material that was deep in the roots of the Himalayan scale range that the death of Iapetus produced, now brought to the surface by 300 million years of erosion, removing everything above it. The highest peak in the Appalachians today is Mount Mitchell in North Carolina, at 6,684 feet above sea level. When the mountains produced by the closing of Iapetus were at their maximum height, that same location was probably sitting beneath several miles of rock that has since been carried away by rivers and deposited somewhere in the shallow marine sediments of the continental shelf. The gentleness of the modern Appalachians, the quality that makes them feel approachable and ancient and worn, is not the original character of these mountains. It is the character that 300 million years of erosion has given to what were once the most dramatic peaks on the surface of the planet. Geologists can read the seam where Iapetus finally closed. In a zone running through the rock of New England and the maritime provinces of Canada, and then continuing across to Scotland and Scandinavia, when you account for the subsequent opening of the Atlantic that separated those regions. There is a boundary in the rock where two ancient continents were sutured together. Rocks whose chemistry and isotopic signatures mark them as having originally formed on what became North America sit directly against rocks whose chemistry marks them as having originally formed on what became Europe. They have been pressed against each other by a collision that reached its peak roughly 300 million years ago, and the pressure that pressed them together has never been fully released. That boundary is called the Iapetus suture. It runs through Vermont and Massachusetts and Maine, through the hills of Connecticut and the rocky coast of Nova Scotia. You have almost certainly driven across it at some point if you have spent any time in New England, and you had no way of knowing it was there, because it does not announce itself in any way that is visible from the surface. It is there, though, in the rock, in the chemistry of the stone, in the record of a collision that happened when land life on this planet was still a new experiment. And the map of the world looked nothing like anything that has ever appeared in any atlas. Those rocks tell you where Iapetus was. They tell you how wide it got and what direction it spread, and roughly when it began to die. They are the most complete record we have of an ocean that has been gone for 300 million years, preserved in the one medium that geological time cannot erase. The rock remembers Iapetus even though the water is gone, even though the coastlines are gone, even though every organism that ever swam in its waters has been dead for so long that their descendants have had time to evolve into entirely new forms of life many times over. Even though not a single molecule of its water survives anywhere on this planet, not a coastline, not a current, not a basin, nothing that would be recognizable as that ocean to anything capable of recognizing oceans. Only the rock, and the rock is enough. But the story of Iapetus does not end with its death, because what the earth does with an ocean it has killed is the strangest part of the whole story, and it is the part that changes what you are looking at when you stand on the eastern coast of this country and look out at the Atlantic. Iapetus is gone. The water is gone. The coastlines are gone. The trilobites that crawled across its floor are gone. Not merely dead, but so thoroughly recycled by geological time that no molecule of their bodies exists in any form that connects it to what it once was. The mountains that the death of Iapetus built have been worn down over 300 million years of rain and ice and river into the gentle forested ridges that millions of Americans walk through every year without any sense that they are crossing something momentous. There is nothing left of it, or so it seems. Pick up a piece of paper, fold it in half, press the crease flat with your finger, hard enough that the fold is sharp and well-defined, hard enough that you can feel the fibers of the paper compressing under the pressure. Now unfold it and lay it flat on the table in front of you. The paper looks almost the same as it did before you folded it. Almost. But there is a line running down its center now. A white crease, where the fibers were compressed and broken by the fold. The paper is flat again. It looks, at a casual glance, like a sheet of paper that has never been folded. But it is not the same paper it was before. Along that crease, the fibers that were broken did not fully reconnect. The paper is weaker there than it is anywhere else. If you fold it again, it will fold along the same line, because the crease has made that line the path of least resistance through the entire sheet. Fold it enough times and the paper will eventually tear along that line, because the accumulated damage of repeated folding concentrates stress at the same location every time. And materials under repeated, concentrated stress eventually give way at the point where they are weakest. This is, in miniature and in approximation, one of the most important principles of how the surface of the Earth works. When two continents collide and an ocean closes, the collision does not simply erase everything that came before it and leave behind an undifferentiated mass of strong continental rock. It leaves a mark, the suture zone, the line through the crust where two pieces of continental material were pressed together under enormous force, is not as strong as the crust on either side of it. It is a zone where rocks from two different continents were mixed and compressed and chemically altered by the heat and pressure of the collision. It is a zone where deep faults run from the surface down through the full thickness of the crust. It is a zone that has already been weakened by one episode of enormous stress, and that carries that weakness forward through geological time. potentially for hundreds of millions of years. Zones of weakness. On a planet whose interior is constantly churning, and whose tectonic plates are constantly moving, and whose continental crust is constantly being subjected to the stresses that plate motion produces, have a way of becoming the sites of future rifting. This is the principle that geologists sometimes describe as the Earth breaking along old wounds. It is not a metaphor. It is a documented pattern in the geological record, observed in enough cases, across enough different continents, and enough different time periods, that it has become a recognized feature of how plate tectonics operates over long timescales. When a supercontinent assembles and then begins to break apart, the rifts that tear it open do not form randomly in the middle of the strongest, most intact portions of the continental crust. They form preferentially in the zones of weakness, the old sutures, the ancient collision scars, the places where the crust has already been compromised by a previous episode of enormous force. The clearest example of this principle in the geological record is Pangaea, the most recent supercontinent, assembled over roughly 100 million years of continental collisions, beginning around 350 million years ago and reaching completion around 250 million years ago. It was not assembled from scratch. It was assembled from pieces of continental crust that had their own long histories of previous collisions and previous rifting cycles, each episode of which had left its own sutures and zones of weakness embedded in the fabric of the crust. The collision that closed Iapetus and assembled the Appalachian Caledonian mountain chain was one of the major events in the assembly of Pangaea. It contributed a suture zone running through what is now eastern North America and northwestern Europe, a long, linear zone of weakness embedded in the crust that records the location where two major continental landmasses were pressed together across the dying Iapetus. That suture was incorporated into Pangaea when the collision was complete, for the next 100 million years or more, while Pangaea existed as a coherent supercontinent. The Iapetus suture was simply part of the continental interior, buried under the sediments and erosional products of the mountains that the collision had built, not active in any tectonic sense, not producing earthquakes or volcanic activity, not doing anything that would draw the attention of any observer looking for signs of geological activity. But it was there, and it was weaker than the crust on either side of it. When Pangaea began to rift apart, starting roughly 200 million years ago, the forces driving the rifting, the upwelling of heat from the mantle below the supercontinent, the gravitational pull of dense oceanic crust at the edges of the continental assemblage, the accumulated stress of a planet whose interior was churning under a stationary lid of continental rock, those forces searched for the path of least resistance through the crust. They found the old wounds. The rift that would eventually become the Central Atlantic propagated along and near the line of the Iapetus suture. The two sides of that suture, which had been locked together since the collision that killed Iapetus, began to pull apart. The crust thinned. The mantle below rose toward the surface. Volcanoes appeared along the rift margins. The ground subsided into long grabens. And then, as the rifting progressed and the gap between the two sides widened enough for seawater to breach the barriers and pour in, the basin began to fill. The Atlantic was born in the grave of Iapetus. Let that land for a moment. Where an ocean died, an ocean was reborn in the same approximate geographic space, with the same approximate arrangement of continental land masses on either side of the opening basin, a new sea filling in the scar tissue of an old one, because the Earth had already weakened the crust in precisely that location through the death of the previous ocean, because the suture of the old collision was the most available path of least resistance for the new rift, because the planet with the impersonal consistency of physics, breaks along its old wounds. The rock under your hand on any trail in the Appalachians is the record of an ocean that opened in this space, spread to a width greater than the modern Atlantic, closed in a collision that built Himalayan-scale mountains, and was then followed, after 100 million years of Pangea existing in the space between, by another ocean opening in roughly the same place. You are standing on the floor of the Atlantic's predecessor. You are looking east, a few hours' drive away, at the Atlantic's present. Same space, different ocean, same cycle. This is the insight that J. Tuzo Wilson arrived at in the 1960s. And it was an insight that changed how geologists understood the long-term history of ocean basins and continental motion. Wilson was trying to explain something that had been puzzling people since the recognition of plate tectonics had made continental drift a mainstream scientific idea. The Appalachian Mountains in eastern North America and the Caledonian Mountains in Scotland and Scandinavia were known to be roughly the same age, produced by the same basic process of continental collision, and built from rock types that matched each other too precisely to be coincidental. But the Atlantic Ocean separates them now. The Appalachians are on the western side of the Atlantic. The Caledonians are on the eastern side. If those two mountain ranges were produced by the same collision, then the continents that collided must have once been joined, with no ocean between them. But the Atlantic is clearly there now, clearly real, clearly an open ocean with thousands of miles of water separating the two mountain chains. Wilson asked the question that the observation demanded. Had there been an ocean before the Atlantic, an ocean that closed in the collision that built both mountain chains, and that was then followed by the opening of a new ocean, the Atlantic, in roughly the same location? The answer, assembled over the following decades by geologists working on both sides of the Atlantic, matching rock types and isotopic signatures and fossil assemblages, and the orientation of ancient magnetic signatures frozen into old volcanic rocks, was yes, Iapetus had existed, it had closed, and the Atlantic had opened in its wake, following the weakness that the closing of Iapetus had left in the crust. The pattern that Wilson recognized in this history is what became known as the Wilson cycle, the idea that ocean basins do not open and close just once, but that the same geographic zones experience repeated cycles of rifting and collision, each cycle leaving behind a zone of weakness that influences where the next cycle begins. The sutures accumulate. The zones of weakness are layered on top of each other, each new scar forming in or near the location of an older one, because the physics of rifting consistently find the weakest available path through the crust. This has implications that extend well beyond the Atlantic and Iapetus. If the Earth systematically reuses its old weak zones for new rifting, then the history of any piece of continental crust is not a linear progression from one state to another. It is a series of cycles. The same crust may have spent portions of its history at the margin of multiple successive oceans, each one opening and closing and leaving its scar, before arriving at the configuration we observe today. The Appalachian rocks carry the record of Iapetus, but they also carry hints of older cycles, older collisions, older oceans that predated Iapetus and whose records are more fragmentary and harder to read, but are not entirely absent. The continental crust is a palimpsest, a surface that has been written on, partially erased, and written on again, many times, with each version leaving traces that the next version builds upon. Now, bring this back to the Atlantic. The Atlantic is open right now. It is spreading. Its margins are geologically quiet, but the suture from the closing of Iapetus is still there. buried beneath the sediments of the Atlantic coastal plain and the folded rocks of the Appalachians, but present, real, traceable by geologists with the right instruments. When the Atlantic eventually closes, and it will close, the collision that closes it will press its own suture into the crust. That suture will mark the location where the two sides of the Atlantic were finally brought back together. And when the supercontinent that forms from that collision eventually begins to rift apart, the forces driving the rifting will search for weakness in the assembled crust. They will find the Atlantic suture, which sits above the Iapetus suture, which may sit above older sutures still, from cycles that ran before Iapetus. In the Precambrian deep time, when the geological record becomes too fragmentary to read with the precision that later eras allow, layer on layer on layer of old wounds, each one a potential template for the next opening. The scar left by Iapetus guided the birth of the Atlantic. The scar left by the Atlantic will guide the birth of whatever ocean comes next. And somewhere in the far future, when that next ocean has lived its life and died its death and left its own mountains and its own suture, the scar it leaves may guide the birth of the ocean after that. The earth does not forget where it has been broken. It cannot forget, because the record of every break is written into the physical structure of the crust itself, into the orientation of old faults, and the chemistry of ancient metamorphic rocks, and the subtle variations in crustal thickness and density that persist long after the surface expression of a collision has been worn away. Every rift that has ever opened on this planet was shaped, at least in part, by the record of the rifts that came before it. Every ocean that has ever existed helped write the template for the next ocean. The scar breathes. It waits. And when the time comes, when the forces are right, and the stress exceeds the strength of the old wound, it opens again. A new sea fills the old grave, and the cycle begins one more time. There is a specific kind of discovery that changes how you see everything that came before it. Not a dramatic discovery, not a moment with trumpets, or a sudden flash of understanding that arrives complete and fully formed. Just a realization, quiet and irreversible, that something you have been looking at your whole life without truly seeing it has been telling you something important the entire time, and you only now have the vocabulary to hear what it is saying. Standing on a mountain and understanding that it used to be an ocean floor is that kind of discovery. Not understanding it in the abstract way that you might understand a fact, read from a textbook and filed away as interesting. Understanding it in the concrete, physical, almost visceral way that happens when you press your hand against a rock on a trail in the Appalachians and realize that the specific stone under your palm was sitting at the bottom of a sea that was wider than the Atlantic before a single animal had ever walked on land. That kind of understanding does not leave. Once it settles in, it changes the way you look at every mountain range you will ever see for the rest of your life. Because the Appalachians are not an isolated case. They are one entry in a list that covers nearly every major mountain belt on the surface of this planet. The geological record is full of mountain ranges that are, at their core, the compressed and folded and uplifted remnants of ocean basins that no longer exist. If you know how to read them, the mountains of the world are a map of vanished oceans, a collection of obituaries written in stone, each one marking the place where a sea lived, its long life, and died, and left behind the only monument that the death of an ocean can produce. Start with the most dramatic example currently visible on Earth, the Himalayas. They are the highest mountains on the planet. Everest, at 29,032 feet above sea level, is the highest point on the surface of the Earth. The entire Himalayan range and the vast Tibetan plateau behind it represent the most extreme example of ongoing continental collision anywhere on the planet. India is still moving northward into Asia at a rate of roughly 2 inches per year. The Himalayas are still rising, adding altitude to what is already the highest terrain on Earth with every passing million years. We already know what is at the summit of Everest. We know it from Chapter 3 of this story. Marine fossils, the shells of sea creatures, limestone built from the compressed calcium carbonate of organisms that fed and reproduced in warm, shallow tropical water. Now sitting at the highest point any surface rock on this planet reaches, above the altitude where commercial aircraft cruise, above the altitude where weather systems produce precipitation, at an elevation where the air contains so little oxygen that an unprotected person loses consciousness within minutes. Those fossils came from Tethys. Tethys was one of the great oceans of the Mesozoic era, the age of dinosaurs, and it dwarfed almost anything on the modern map. At its maximum extent, it stretched from what is now the Atlantic coast of Spain eastward across what is now the Middle East and Central Asia and South Asia, all the way to what is now Southeast Asia. A warm tropical seaway cutting across the equatorial region of the planet for roughly 200 million years. Its shores were lined with coral reefs. Its warm, well-lit, chemically rich waters supported an extraordinary diversity of marine life, including many of the large marine reptiles, the plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs and mosasaurs, that ruled entirely separate domains from the terrestrial dinosaurs. Tethys was enormous, ancient, biologically rich, and by any measure a major feature of the planetary surface during its long existence. And then India moved. India was originally part of Gondwana, the great southern supercontinent that also included Antarctica, Australia, South America, and Africa. When Gondwana began to fragment, India rifted away from the rest of the landmass and began moving northward, propelled by seafloor, spreading opening behind it in what became the Indian Ocean. It moved fast by the standards of continental motion, covering distances that other plates take far longer to cross. It was on a direct collision course with the southern margin of Asia, and between India and Asia lay the eastern portion of Tethys. As India moved north, the floor of eastern Tethys was subducted beneath the Asian margin. The ocean shrank. Volcanoes appeared above the subduction zone along what is now the southern edge of Tibet. The ocean got narrower every million years, its floor disappearing into the mantle at the same rate that India's northward motion was consuming it. Around 50 to 40 million years ago, India reached Asia. The collision that followed is still going on. India has not stopped. The subcontinent is still moving north at roughly 2 inches per year, still driving under the southern edge of Asia, still adding pressure to a collision zone that has been building mountains for 50 million years. The Himalayas are the direct product of this ongoing collision. The crustal material caught between the two converging plates being compressed and thickened and pushed upward by forces that have not relented since the moment of contact. Tethys is gone, the ocean that stretched from Spain to Southeast Asia, that hosted 200 million years of extraordinary biological diversity, that shaped the climate and the ocean circulation of the entire Mesozoic world, exists now only in the rocks that were scraped off its descending floor during subduction and plastered against the margins of the collision zone, and in the compressed sedimentary layers that were caught between the converging continents and pushed upward when the ocean closed. Those rocks are at the summit of Everest. They are in the cliff faces of the Karakoram. They are in the Zagros Mountains of Iran, where the Arabian Plate is still pressing into Asia along the western continuation of the same collision system. They are in the Taurus Mountains of Turkey and the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan and northern India. The Himalayas, in their entirety, are Tethys written in stone. The Alps tell the same story at a smaller scale, but they tell it with a clarity that makes them one of the most instructive examples of the Wilson cycle anywhere on Earth. Drive through Switzerland. Take any road that cuts through the mountains rather than tunneling beneath them. Any road that climbs into the high country and traverses the passes that European peoples have been crossing for thousands of years. Look at the rock faces on either side of you. Look at the folded layers visible in the cliff faces above the road. The way the rock has been bent and compressed into shapes that have nothing to do with the gentle horizontal layering that sedimentary rock has when it is first deposited on an ocean floor, and everything to do with the enormous force that was applied to it when the ocean floor it formed on was caught between two converging continents. That rock is ocean floor. The Alps were built by the closing of a western portion of Tethys, a branch of the great tropical seaway that existed between what would become Africa and what would become Europe. As Africa moved northward toward Europe, across the shrinking western Tethys, the oceanic floor between them was subducted beneath the European margin. The sediments that had accumulated on that floor, and the rocks of the oceanic crust itself, were compressed and folded and pushed upward as the collision progressed. The mountains that resulted are the Alps. The process is ongoing. Africa is still moving north. The Mediterranean Sea, that body of water that has shaped so much of human history, that was the center of the ancient world for the Greeks and Romans and Phoenicians and Egyptians, that has been crossed by traders and conquerors and explorers for thousands of years, is the remnant of Western Tethys, squeezed between two converging plates, slowly losing its floor to subduction at its margins. The Mediterranean is an ocean in the late stages of its life. It is narrowing, slowly, imperceptibly, by any standard of human observation, but measurably by the instruments of modern geodesy. The African plate is pressing northward into the Eurasian plate at a rate of roughly an inch or two per year across different parts of the boundary. That motion is building the Alps higher, compressing the Apennines of Italy, driving the geological activity that makes southern Europe one of the most seismically active regions in the Western world. Given enough time, tens of millions of years at minimum, and possibly more, depending on the geometry of the collision and the rates involved, the Mediterranean will close completely. The floor between Africa and Europe will be entirely consumed by subduction. The two continents will make full contact. The collision will produce a mountain range running from Spain eastward through the current location of the Mediterranean basin to the Middle East. A range built from the compressed remains of an ocean floor that has supported human civilization on its shores for the entirety of recorded history. The ancestors of the fossils in those future mountains are alive in the Mediterranean right now. The Urals are older still, and in some ways more instructive about the deep timescales of the Wilson cycle, precisely because they have had so much time to be worn down that they no longer look, to a casual observer, like the product of a major continental collision. The Ural Mountains run roughly 2,500 miles through Russia, forming the conventional geographic boundary between Europe and Asia, a boundary that has appeared on maps and in geographic descriptions for centuries. They are not impressive mountains by the standards of the Alps or the Himalayas. The highest peak, Mount Narodnaya, reaches barely 6,000 feet above sea level. Modest enough that it would not attract particular attention if it were located anywhere in the American West. Their slopes are gentle. Their valleys are broad. They may have the quality of very old things that have been worn smooth by time, which is exactly what they are. Around 300 million years ago, the continent of Siberia, which was at that time a separate landmass moving on its own tectonic plate, collided with the eastern margin of Proto-Europe, the ocean between them, which geologists call the Paleo-Asian Ocean, or sometimes the Ural Ocean, closed completely. The collision was of similar scale to the Appalachian-Caledonian collision that closed Iapetus. It assembled a major portion of the Eurasian landmass. It built mountains that, at their peak 300 million years ago, were probably comparable in scale to the modern Alps, steep-sided and dramatic, the product of an enormous amount of continental crust being compressed into a much smaller horizontal space 300 million years of erosion later. Those mountains are the Urals, worn down to a fraction of their original height, their sharp edges rounded by countless freeze-thaw cycles, their roots exposed by the removal of miles of overlying rock, but their suture still runs through them, still readable in the chemistry and the isotopic signatures of the rock if you know what to look for, still marking the line where two continents were pressed together across a vanished ocean, the boundary between Europe and Asia that appears on every world map, the boundary that has been used for centuries to divide the Eurasian landmass into its two cultural and geographical halves, is, at its geological core, the scar of an ocean that closed 300 million years ago. Different mountains, different oceans, different timescales, but the same question written in the rock of every single one of them. Step back from the individual examples now and look at the pattern that all of them together reveal. Appalachians, Caledonians, Himalayas, Alps, Urals, 5 of the most significant mountain ranges in the Northern Hemisphere, spanning multiple continents and covering a range of geological ages from roughly 300 million years to the present day. Each of them was built by the closing of an ocean. Each of them contains, somewhere in its rocks, the compressed remnant of an ocean floor that no longer exists anywhere on the surface of the Earth. Each of them marks a line in the crust where two continental masses came together across a sea that had occupied the space between them for hundreds of millions of years. None of these mountain ranges began as mountains. Every one of them began as water, as a rift in a continent that filled with seawater and became a young sea that spread and widened and became an ocean and aged and died and left its rocks to be compressed and uplifted into the terrain that now bears the name we know. The mountain ranges of the world are not random features of the landscape produced by random geological events. They are a systematic record. A record of the cycle that has been running on this planet for as long as plate tectonics has operated, which is at least 1 billion years and possibly significantly longer. They are the punctuation marks in a story that has no beginning that we can clearly read and no ending that we can foresee. Every significant mountain chain on this planet is a question. The question is always the same. What ocean was here? And the answer, when you can find it in the rock, is always the same kind of story. An ocean opened in a rift. It spread across hundreds of millions of years, widening at the pace of fingernails, growing, filling with life, shaping the climate of its time, defining the geography of a world that no longer exists. It aged. Its floor became dense and began to sink at the margins. It shrank. The continents on its shores approached each other across a narrowing sea. They made contact, and everything caught between them. All the accumulated material of the ocean floor and its margins, all the sediment and the volcanic rock and the compressed remains of the life that had lived in its waters was pushed upward into the only monument that the death of an ocean can produce. The ocean built its own grave marker when it died, and that grave marker is still there, in the Appalachians, where 300 million years of rain have softened the edges but not erased the record. In the Himalayas, where the collision is still ongoing and the grave marker is still being built, still growing taller, still pushing the compressed floor of Tethys higher into the sky with every passing year. In the Alps, where you can drive through the grave marker on a summer afternoon and see the folded ocean floor in the cliff faces above the road. In the Urals, where 300 million years of erosion have left a grave marker so worn that most people who cross it on the Trans-Siberian Railway have no idea what they are passing through. The rock does not forget. It cannot forget, because forgetting would require the physical erasure of a record that is written into the mineral structure of the stone itself, into the orientation of crystals that grew under specific pressures in specific directions, into the isotopic ratios of elements that carry the chemical signature of the environment in which they formed, into the fossils of organisms that lived in a sea that no longer exists and that are preserved in limestone, that used to sit on the floor of that sea and that now sits at whatever altitude 300 or 50 or 20 million years of mountain building and erosion have delivered it to. The rock remembers Iapetus. The rock at the summit of Everest remembers Tethys. The folded layers in the Swiss Alps remember the western branch of Tethys that closed before the Alps were built. The worn, rounded ridges of the Urals remember the Paleo-Asian Ocean. And, sitting in the eastern United States, rounded and forested and patient, the Appalachians remember Iapetus while looking east at the Atlantic. They have seen this before. They know how the story goes. They are waiting, with the complete indifference of very old stone, for the next chapter. Go back to the trail, not the specific trail you started on at the beginning of this story. Any trail, any place anywhere in the Appalachian chain where you can stop walking and stand still and put your hand on the rock and feel the ground beneath you and look out over a forested landscape that extends in every direction as far as you can see. Utterly stable, utterly permanent, utterly indifferent to the fact that you are standing in it. You know something now that you did not know at the beginning, not a fact that you can use in any practical way, not a piece of information that will help you navigate your life or make a decision or solve a problem that matters in any immediate sense, but something that changes the way you see the physical world around you in a way that, once it has happened, does not unhappen. The ground you are standing on is not permanent. The Appalachians beneath your feet are not permanent. The Atlantic that you can reach in a few hours by driving east is not permanent. The map of the world that hangs in every classroom, that appears on every globe, that you have been looking at since you were old enough to read a map, is not a portrait of how the Earth is. It is a snapshot of how the Earth happens to be arranged right now, at this particular moment, in a history that stretches back 4.5 billion years and forward an equal distance that no model and no imagination can fully reach. You are living on a draft. The Atlantic Ocean is 2.5 centimeters wider today than it was at this time last year. It has been getting wider at roughly this rate for 180 million years, accumulating width, one finger breadth at a time, across a span of time so vast that the entire history of complex life on land, from the first amphibians to every human civilization ever built, occupies only the last fraction of it. The ocean has been growing since before the first flowering plant evolved, Since before the first bird took flight, since before the first mammal nursed its young, it has been growing through all of the evolutionary history that produced everything alive on its shores today. And it shows no sign of stopping. But it will stop. Not soon. Not in any time frame that connects to anything a human being needs to plan for, or that a human institution needs to account for, or that a human civilization needs to worry about. The timescales involved in the Atlantic's eventual closure are so vast that every language currently spoken on Earth will almost certainly have changed beyond recognition before the process is well underway. Every nation currently bordering the Atlantic will have transformed into something unrecognizable. Every coastline currently mapped will have been reshaped multiple times by sea level changes and erosion and tectonic movement that have nothing to do with the grand closing of the ocean itself. But eventually, the spreading will slow. The balance between creation at the mid-Atlantic ridge and consumption at the margins will tip. The passive margins that are geologically quiet right now will begin to show signs of activity. Subduction will begin to consume the Atlantic floor at its edges. In the Caribbean, perhaps. Near Gibraltar, perhaps. Along the eastern margin of the Americas, perhaps. In ways and places and sequences that no model currently available can predict with precision. And the ocean will begin to close. Some researchers who model the long-term future of the planet's tectonic configuration suggest that the Atlantic may already be showing the earliest whispers of this transition in places like the Caribbean and the Mediterranean margins. These interpretations are contested. The data is complex. The system operates at scales that make definitive prediction genuinely difficult. But the direction of the eventual outcome is not contested by anyone who works seriously on these questions. The Atlantic will follow the same arc that Iapetus followed, the same arc that Tethys followed, the same arc that the Paleo-Asian Ocean followed, the same arc that every ocean that has ever existed on this planet has followed. Because that arc is not a coincidence or a tendency or a pattern that might have exceptions. It is physics. It is the unavoidable consequence of oceanic crust being made hot and becoming cold and becoming dense, and eventually, when it reaches the margins of the basin it was born in, descending back into the mantle it came from. The physics does not have exceptions. The only variable is timing. When the Atlantic closes, it will leave mountains. Mountains running along the line of the collision, through whatever geography exists at that time, where the eastern coasts of North and South America and the western coasts of Europe and Africa finally come together across a sea that is no longer between them. The cities that exist on those coasts right now, the cities that have been built over centuries and millennia into some of the most complex and densely inhabited places on the surface of the planet, those cities will not be coastal cities anymore. They will be somewhere in the interior of a supercontinent, inland, behind a mountain range that does not yet exist, far from a coastline that will have ceased to exist tens of millions of years before. The ocean that the modern world was built around will leave behind the same thing that Iapetus left behind. Mountains, a suture, a story in the rock. And somewhere in the deep future, when that supercontinent begins to rift apart along the old weakness left by the closing of the Atlantic, the suture that the Atlantic's death will leave will guide the opening of the next ocean, the way the Iapetus suture guided the opening of the Atlantic, the way the suture before Iapetus guided the opening of Iapetus, layer on layer of old wounds, cycle on cycle on cycle. We are living in the gap between drafts. Every map of the world ever made shows the same basic configuration. The Americas on one side, Europe and Africa on the other, the Atlantic between them, the Pacific stretching from the Americas to Asia, The arrangement that every child learns in school and that every adult takes for granted as a permanent feature of physical reality. It is a snapshot, one frame in a film that has been running for 4.5 billion years and that will run for billions of years more, long after any film made by any human hand has crumbled to dust, and the medium it was recorded on has been recycled into something entirely different by the patient geological processes that recycle everything eventually. Go back to the Appalachian Trail one more time. Put your boots on the rock. Press your hand flat against the stone face. Feel how cold it is, how solid, how utterly indifferent to your presence, to your weight, to the warmth of your hand, to the fact that you know what it is. You are touching the floor of Iapetus. You are standing on the ruins of an ocean that lived for 200 million years and spread to a width greater than the modern Atlantic and hosted the first explosion of complex animal life on this planet, and then died so completely that not a single molecule of its water survives anywhere on Earth. Not a coastline, not a current, not a basin. Nothing that would be recognizable as that ocean to anything capable of recognizing oceans. Only this rock. The mountains around you are its monument. They were built by the collision that killed it, pushed skyward by the compression of everything that was caught between two converging continents, worn down by 300 million years of rain and ice and river into the gentle forested ridges you are standing in right now. And a few hours to the east of where you are standing, past the rolling hills of the Piedmont and the flat coastal plain and the barrier islands and the shallow continental shelf dropping away into deep water. The Atlantic is doing what Iapetus once did, spreading, growing, adding width at the pace of fingernails, building the sediment layers on its floor that will someday, in a chapter of this story that has not been written yet, be scraped off a descending slab and plastered against the margin of a continent that has not yet formed, from the reassembly of land masses that have not yet collided. 2 oceans, 1 space, 1 cycle. The first ocean is under your feet, written in every grain of the rock under your hand. The second ocean is a few hours east, alive and growing, still in the part of its story where everything looks permanent and nothing suggests that it has ever been anything other than what it is right now. The Earth does not keep its oceans forever. It builds them from wounds in continents. It grows them across hundreds of millions of years at the pace that fingernails grow. It ages them and tips them into decline and consumes their flaws and closes them in collisions that build mountain ranges from what was once a seafloor. And when the mountains have been worn down and the suture has been buried and all that remains of the old ocean is the record in the rock, it breaks open the old wound and begins again. It has done this before. It is doing it right now. It will do it long after the last person who ever read these words has become, through the patient chemistry of the earth, part of the rock itself. And somewhere in the stone, beneath your boots, Iapetus is still there too, compressed and folded and 300 million years quiet, waiting in the only way that very old things can wait, which is without any awareness of waiting at all, for the next chapter of a story that the earth has been telling since long before anything was alive to listen.